Hello and welcome to another Healthy Bite. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am recording this, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, this week's episode was with the very, I think she's terrific, Professor Julia Rucklidge, Professor of Psychology from Canterbury University in Christchurch in New Zealand. And the episode is called, rather appealingly, The Better Brain, which references her book, which she co-authored with Professor Bonnie Kaplan and was released in April of this year. So Julia talks about the use of nutrients, and specifically micronutrients, in improving mental health. And it's such an interesting conversation, and actually coincidentally, in the same week that I was talking to Julia, there was also a wonderful article published in the Journal of Oncology coming out just last week, which talked about the use of micronutrients in improving immune function in oncology. What a surprise. Now, I've said before that I think the study of the basic sciences is just so important. Anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, that's all of the processes that go on in all of your cells from the moment you are conceived to the moment we die. So biochemistry is pretty important. Histology, the study of cells, because after all, we are made up of, 50 trillion cells, not to mention 10 times more microbes. So there's a lot of cells going on. So knowing how they work is a very important part of health. Now, one of the things that Julia said in her in my discussion with her, which has really got me thinking a lot, and that was that it's important for health practitioners to have both skepticism and curiosity. And I thought, that is a really good combination, because you have to be a little skeptical. You can't believe everything that you're told, but by the same token, you should be curious, which kind of got me thinking about at what point do most medical practitioners' curiosity actually kick in, because so often the study of nutrition, and in particular micronutrients. Now, micronutrients, you may not be familiar with that term, but you'd certainly be familiar with things like iron, magnesium, calcium, zinc, selenium. There are something like 50 or so elements within the periodic table that we need to function properly. And to fully understand that, I had another wonderful conversation with Dr. Sarah Myhill, which is a doctor specialising in chronic fatigue, and that episode will be coming out in another few weeks. But she said something to me in the same week that I was interviewing Julia, which I just thought made so much sense, and that was that if you think of our lives as a book, and that book begins from the moment of conception, goes through our life in utero, as a newborn, as a infant, as a toddler, as a child, as a teenager, as an adolescent, young adult, etc., etc. And you think of your life literally as a book written out using all 26 letters of the alphabet. And here's the critical part. You get to use all 26 letters of the alphabet. Well, micronutrients are a bit like that. Our body needs those 50 or so micronutrients to write the story of our life, or to write it as well as it possibly can be written. But what if I said to you, I'm going to get you to take 10 of those letters out of your book of life? I'm going to get you to take A, B, C, D, E, F, etc. The first 10 letters. Let's take the first 10 letters up to J. No, let's also include K as well. And let's take those 11 letters out of the alphabet. Well, all of a sudden, your book starts to look a little bit confused. In fact, it doesn't make that much sense. And understanding the role that biochemistry plays in that is really important. And it's interesting when we talk about the curiosity of health practitioners, the question is, at what point in their professional development does that curiosity kick in? I know for myself, I studied dentistry for 5 years. The first 2 years were these subjects which, look, once I got through them, I could get on with really studying dentistry and really what it was all about. Those subjects, anatomy, yeah, I passed that. Physiology, sure, I learned how the body systems work, the respiratory system, the digestive system, the immune system. I learned all about that. What blood does as it tracks around the body. Passed all those exams. Biochemistry, oh my God, so complicated. You had to learn all those processes that go on in the human body and all those annoying cofactors and vitamins and minerals that you need to make the next step follow to the next step, to the next step, to the next step, to make a body function optimally. Couldn't wait to pass that exam. Thank God we got through that. Then I got into third year and boy did I start to learn what dentistry was all about. And for doctors in their second or third year, they start to learn, or they did when I was going through, start to learn about pathology, the study of disease. Is it an infection? Is it an inflammation? Is it a cancer? Is that cancer malignant or benign? These were all important questions. And then we learnt about pharmacology, which was how we were going to manage those diseases. Now, this was really interesting. This was what medicine and dentistry was all about. But wait, it is, if the model is just to manage chronic disease, what about if I wanted to learn about what actually caused that disease? Well, I learnt early on in my career, in fact, a year after I graduated, when I was asked to give a talk to a study group, or actually it was 2 or 3 years after I graduated, when I was asked to give a talk to a study group on nutrition, and I thought, oh, actually there is something here, and I began my first course in nutrition, which came to me as cassettes. There was no such thing as online, and it was the International Academy of Nutrition. In 1981 I did my first course. And that was the beginning of my curiosity in things which I had ignored in the first 2 years of my degree, which turned out to be really important because it explained why things go wrong. And I think that's quite important. So skepticism and curiosity, yes, I get that. I think it's very important. But, I think the curiosity should start from the very beginning of our training and really to understand how the human body works and what goes wrong when it doesn't. And if I was to remove 10 or 11 letters from your alphabet in your book of life, your book of your life would not make as much sense as it could if we used all 26 letters. And similarly, if we don't use all of the nutrients that we need to make our biochemistry work in our cells, that make our physiology work optimally, then things start to go wrong. And those things are preventable chronic degenerative diseases like heart disease, cancer, autoimmune conditions, of which there are almost 100, diabetes, mental health issues, etc. And in this episode with Julia Rucklidge, she has done a great deal of research on the influence of micronutrients on brain health, on mental health. And she also expresses her frustration with RCTs. Now, RCTs stand for randomized controlled studies. Now, this starts another very important issue, which I think you, as a member of the public, we're all patients, but as a member of the public, it's important to understand this randomized control trials, which are now held up to be the gold standard in medicine. And I think we have bought into a system which is flawed. And it's flawed for many reasons, and I'm not the only one who says this, because it's very difficult, I think, to discern the difference between evidence-based medicine and evidence-based marketing. You see, the vast majority of the science in medicine, and I think it's conservatively estimated to be around 70%, is paid for by the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry ultimate goal is to find blockbuster drugs. Now, blockbuster drugs are classified, I think, as generating about $1 billion worth of sales. And there are many, many blockbuster drugs. Statins, anti-cholesterol drugs like Lipitor, Crestor are good examples of that. Antidepressant drugs are another good example of that. Drugs that prevent reflux, heartburn, indigestion, like Nexium, protein pump inhibitors. They're another blockbuster drugs. And of course, how do you do a trial for a drug? You take one drug and you compare it to a sugar pill, and you find out whether that drug is more effective at dealing with the problem at hand than the sugar pill. And that is called a randomized controlled study, because you don't tell the person who is taking the drug, which they're getting. So that's the randomized control. And double-blind randomized control means you don't tell the practitioner either. So that has become the gold standard, and we have bought into this. And I quote here the work of Stanford University Professor Jon Ioannidis. Now, Jon Ioannidis is perhaps one of the most cited academics in the world. I mean, almost 200,000 citations, which is extraordinary, because if you've ever written an academic journal and you've been cited or repeated by other researchers 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 1,000 times, you're doing incredibly well. Well, his work's been quoted almost 200,000 times. So I think he's worth listening to. And he says there's a difference between that evidence-based medicine's been hijacked by the pharmaceutical industry, who funds the science in medicine. And this is relevant to our discussion with Julia, because she cites her frustration with this as the gold standard of determining whether something is effective or not. And when we come to studying micronutrients, then it becomes really problematic, because it would be like me saying, I'm going to study electricity. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a light switch and I'm going to just put it in the wall, and I'm going to switch that. It's not going to be connected to anything. And I'm going to switch it on and see whether it causes the electricity to go on and off. And I go, oh, no, it doesn't. Oh, well, the light switch has not passed the randomized control. Some are switched on and some are connected to, but it's unclear. It suggests that perhaps the light switch is connected, but what if I just did one on the wire on its own and thought, well, I'm going to check the wire and see whether that is what provides electricity. Or maybe I would burn some coal. No, that doesn't do it either. Hey, it turns out that I need the coal, or actually let's say sunlight, or wind, or wave. There's so many alternatives, that's a whole other story. But for the time being, let's look at coal, which generates a turbine, which then stores energy and generates that energy through an electrical wire, which comes to our house, and I use the light switch to switch it on. And hey, guess what? All of those things were important in delivering electricity to my home. But if I picked out any one of those and tested it and delivering that electricity, it would show that that has no effect. So similarly, if I was doing a study on vitamin D, for example, and thought vitamin D, I'm going to look at vitamin D on its own. It's such a flawed model for testing micronutrients or nutrients in our body, because that's not how it works. If you've been a regular listener to our podcast, you will know that you can't assimilate vitamin D without magnesium, at least, and many other micronutrients along the way. So they all interact, and that is the frustration of randomized controlled trials when it comes to the human body, to the biochemistry of the human body, to the histology of the human body, to the immune function and physiology of the human body. Anyway, it was such a great episode. It got me thinking a lot about skepticism, good. Curiosity, when does that kick in? The shortcomings of randomized controlled trials. And it also reminded me, and I'll give you a little preview here, of another wonderful podcast coming up very soon with Professor Pasi Sahlberg. Now, he is a world leader in education. Yes, we covered that as well. But the reason I mention it to you is one of the things that we discussed was that there were elements that are important in our education, in our modern world. And that is relevant to this discussion and every discussion we really have. And he discussed 4 critical C's, if you like: critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. That's the 4 critical C's that we should be really basing our education system on. Again, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity to arm our children for the new world, for the modern world we live in. And to that I would add 2 more C's: curiosity and compassion. Anyway, I think this week is well worth watching, listening to. Actually, you can watch it on the YouTube channel. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.